So we're just finishing off by fitting the reversing lever onto the footplate and the reach rod. You can't get this the wrong way around because the bolts are two different sizes, but you can get it up the other way, so that's the way it needs to go. Now we come to the nitty-gritty of setting the valves. So we've got three valves here. The middle one is the reverser, and then there's one for each of the cylinders. And you see they've got a little etched line on them. Well, that's the setting mark. So you see the reversing one moving to and fro there. When it's right in, it should be on that setting mark. And you can adjust it on these nuts and tighten them up accordingly. And then the other two, when you turn the wheels round, you'll see the valves go in and out, and the very furthest in should be right on that little setting mark. So that's the easy part of setting the valves. And then we come to the timing, which is actually this part on the leading axle. And we've got to set the eccentrics here to match the crank pin. So setting up the timing on this loco can be quite fiddly. So we've got the diagram here that shows the cylinder, left-hand cylinder on front dead centre, and the eccentric is then 90 degrees round from it. That's just on the left-hand side. We're dealing just with one cylinder. So with that crank pin on the front dead centre, and this is the eccentric we're talking about, and you can judge it by the little screw in there when it's on its top dead centre. So I did all this and tried to get it running, and it ran perfectly well in reverse, but wouldn't run in forward no matter how much I fiddled around with everything. And I discovered that I put too much sealant in this plate on the bottom of the valve block, and it blocked up one of those little holes. So I'm just going to reseal that without so much sealant, let it go off, and then we can see if we can get it running properly. So we're having another go with the air test. That's a bit better. That's in reverse, and we've got mid gear, which doesn't go, and forward. So yeah, that's much more satisfactory. We're now on to page 7, which is all the extra parts to go on the chassis. So it should be pretty straightforward. We've got 2 buffer beams, some steps, couplers, and I've sorted out the nuts and bolts to do this job. So we can make a start. Right, well, we've got the buffer beam on and the couplers. And I've also put this little step on each side of the chassis, and I'm just putting the last bolt in to the buffer beam there. These little bolts are a bit tricky, so I've got a method of holding them so that you can get them into a tight spot if you can't actually get your fingers in there. I've doubled over a bit of masking tape. I stick it on the top of the nut runner, and then I stick the bolt on the end of it. And that gives you a lot better chance of getting it into its hole and getting the thread started. Once it's started, you've got to take the bit of tape off, and then you can get in and actually tighten up the screw. Moving on to page 8, you see we've got the boiler to deal with. So we're now all done with the chassis. We can put that to one side for the moment. And look into the parts for stage 8. Well, that's obviously got to be the boiler itself. There's a big piece of packing on the top to protect all the fittings. This, I can tell, is a steam pipe. And then a nice big bag of bits, which should keep us busy for a while. Burner, too sure what that part is. Some steam pipes. We've got various blanks and fittings, fillers, safety valves, pressure gauge pipe, parts of the gas valve and the regulator, water gauge. So yes, that should keep us out of mischief for a while. So we're into stage 8 now, and I've started to assemble all the parts on the boiler. I put the little dummy check valves on, safety valves, the filler valve, that's a Goodall valve, so for filling the boiler, and also you can pump in under pressure. I put the banjo bolt in here for the pressure gauge, but I'm not going to put that on for the sec. There's a steam pipe loose there, and these are parts for the water gauge. So the regulator has got its O-ring fitted. That's a bit of a struggle to squeeze it on, but it's there. And a little spot of oil on it just to help it in position. And then it should just screw in. And I've set it to turn off at about that position with the grub screw on the back here. The water gauge will then be on these two fittings with that part between the two. And I've got various nuts and O-rings to go on that on final assembly. Also at this end of the boiler we've got the main steam pipe and the burner to go in. So this is the main steam pipe. Just make sure I've got the right end. I think it has that little drop bit on the one at the front. Drop it down, it comes out of the front of the boiler and goes into the slot at the back here. And then the burner itself, squeeze that one out of the way for the moment. So the burner also goes in, and there's a little slot in the burner to go over that pipe. So that will go over like so. A little bit of a fiddle. There we are, that's the burner in place. And there's one screw only holds the burner onto the back of the boiler. There's two holes, but that other one doesn't have a screw in it. That pipe will then join up here with the steam pipe from the regulator. I'll put some sealant on all of these banjo fittings on final assembly. We're looking at the gauge glass now, but before we start that, I should just point out I showed this steam pipe the wrong way round. The drop end is actually at the back of the boiler, not the front. There's a real sequence to get right for this gauge glass. So I pulled the top off the water gauge connection there, and I've got these two gland nuts. There's a little O-ring that goes inside. You need to get that O-ring into the bottom of the nut before you start. So it's sitting right up against the edge there. Then one of them goes on the gauge glass, and then the other one. So they're both O-ring out. Now that one can go into the bottom, and you get the nut down onto its thread. It can be a bit of a fight. There we are, that started. I'm only doing this finger tight at the moment. Now the top one, before this goes in, we've got to get this little nut on it. So the nut goes on first and clamps that top fitting. There we are, and then the union goes up and seals the O-ring against that thread. on the top. So that's the fitting. It's only finger tight at the moment. Obviously I'm going to tighten it all up in a sec. And then that top banjo bolt goes in to complete the assembly. And I will put sealant on these on final assembly, and all we have to do now is the blowdown on the water gauge, which is these parts here. So I'll assemble up that lot in a sec. Last parts to go on the boiler. We've got this little collar to go on the burner that adjusts the gas air mixture, which we'll do once we're a bit further along. And then I've got the blowdown to go in the bottom of the water gauge. So it has a little ball in it. And then this fitting screws in. Oh, nearly. There we go. And the handle, which has got 3 little grub screws and a long handle, and that will set the exact position for the blowdown. We won't really know that until we've got a bit further on with the assembly. And the last part is the boiler band. I fitted one of the boiler bands, and this is the second one, which goes near the front. They come straight and they have to be bent round. So I'm curling it into a loop. And the idea is that it sits quite firmly on the boiler, doesn't spring apart when you come to fit the tiny little nuts and bolts. So I'll get that a bit tighter and hold it on with a bit of masking tape while I get the nut and bolt through.